All right, so you're here with us because you want to understand what's going on with the economy, but like maybe without needing to wade through like a ton of econ jargon, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you want those aha moments without feeling like you need a PhD, you know?
That's totally it. And that is precisely why we are here today. We're going deep on this book by Kyla Scanlon, In This Economy.
It's a good one.
It's a really great one. I was really impressed. And, we always like to start these off with a quote. And Morgan Housel, who wrote the foreword, he just like nailed it when he said that Scanlon has a knack for connecting how the economy works with the very human way we make financial choices.
Yeah, I think that's kind of her superpower.
It is. She gets that it's not just about these cold numbers,
Well, right.
It's how those numbers actually like resonate with us in our everyday lives.
And I think that's the thing that, a lot of economic discussion kind of misses the mark on.
Totally. Okay, so for this deep dive, think of this as mission control for your economic understanding.
Right.
We're going to like build a solid foundation on how money actually works and how we even begin to measure this massive, often confusing thing that we call the economy right.
Right, because you turn on the news and it's just like a fire hose of information.
It's so much.
How do you make sense of it all?
Yeah, and Scanlon, in her book, she really helps with that. So we're zeroing in specifically on part 2, how money works, and part 3, how money is measured.
Those are the core.
Yes.
Those are the foundations.
And, we consider this like a fast track to becoming well-informed on really the essential stuff.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the weird world of money. That's a great chapter title. The mechanics of modern money. And then we're going to get into how we track all this stuff. So supply and demand.
The classics.
The classic. We've got GDP and the economy. Everyone throws that term around GDP. What does it even mean?
What is it, really?
And then we get into commodities, how those are influencing things. And then the big one, inflation. And then we wrap it all up with monetary policy and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
It's the whole landscape.
It is a lot, but we're going to extract those like crucial insights. Like the stuff that truly matters.
The stuff that matters for you.
Exactly. So think of this as your shortcut.
Right.
No more like glazed over eyes when those economic headlines are like bombarding you, right?
Right.
We're going to equip you with, the essential knowledge and that context to really navigate this world.
To be able to understand it a little bit better.
With more confidence, a little bit less of that overwhelm.
I like that. Less overwhelmed?
Less overwhelmed. That's our goal.
That's good.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Scanlon starts out with the weird world of money. And it really is. It like makes you think about something that we just totally take for granted.
Yeah, it's true. And I love the way she kind of uses history as this lens to examine, how did we get to where we are today?
It's a great way to look at it.
Right. And so she talks about how early societies often relied on bartering, right? So I trade you my apples, you trade me your bread or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But she makes this point, like, imagine trying to trade something that's less divisible.
Yeah.
Like you're trying to trade a cow for grain.
Oh, yeah. Like how many bushels of grain is this one cow worth?
Right, exactly. Like how do you even,
It's a negotiation every time.
It's a hassle.
Yeah.
And the value fluctuates so much. So it's like, maybe one day it's 10 bushels, the next day it's 8 bushels. Who knows?
Yeah, that sounds like a whole comedy sketch trying to like barter with a cow for some grain.
Right.
But that's how it used to be.
That's how it was. And she also brings up this anthropologist, David Graeber, who has this idea that, maybe early communities were more based on just kind of like sharing resources.
Right.
But, as societies get bigger and more complex and they interact with each other more, you really need something a little more standardized to make things run smoothly.
Totally.
So that's where money comes in, right?
Exactly. And that's where Scanlon takes us all the way back to Mesopotamia.
Ancient.
3500 BCE. So this is like, the first known region to use a more formal monetary system. And it was these clay tokens that represented different goods and services.
I love that. So like, just imagine these little clay objects.
Yeah.
That was money.
The first money. It's so cool.
Right. And she includes this little detail that I just love from this economic historian named Edward Chancellor. He points out that the Mesopotamians were charging interest on loans before they even invented wheels for carts.
Oh, wow. Different priorities.
Different priorities, man.
So then this leads to a really interesting question, like what actually makes something work as money?
Right. Like, how do we decide this thing has value?
Exactly. And Scanlon lays out those requirements. So first, it needs to be a medium of exchange. So something that everyone is willing to accept in exchange for, all the goods and services.
Like, that'd be universally accepted pretty much.
Right. Or at least within that society. Then it has to be a store of value, meaning it holds its worth relatively well over time.
Right. You don't want something that's going to rot away or lose its value in a week.
Exactly.
You want to be able to hold on to it and still have it mean something later.
Exactly. And third, it needs to be a unit of account, which basically means it's a way to measure and compare the value of different things.
So you can say, okay, this is worth 2 of those and that's worth 5 of those and so on.
Right. And then she also touches on the whole, story of American currency from its beginnings during the Revolution to where it is today. But I think the real meat of it comes when she starts talking about the mechanics of modern money.
Right, because that's the stuff that most people just have no idea about.
No clue. And, you hear these terms like fractional reserve banking, and it's like, what does that even mean?
Sounds scary.
Right. But Scanlon actually explains it in a way that clicks. So basically, when you deposit your paycheck, let's say the bank doesn't just lock all that cash in a vault, right?
No, they don't.
They loan out the majority of it.
They do. They're putting it to work.
Right, because they know that not everybody is going to want to withdraw all of their money at the same time.
Right. That's the assumption.
So this is how banks make their profit through what's called the net interest margin. So they earn more on the money they lend out than what they pay you in interest.
Right. So it's that spread between what they're earning and what they're paying out.
Exactly. So this raises a really important point for everybody listening. Think about it. Does every dollar you see in your bank account actually exist as physical cash right now?
I mean, if you think about it, the answer is probably no.
The answer is no.
Right.
It's all thanks to this system that we have.
Right. It's based on this kind of assumption that, only a fraction of the total deposits is actually going to be needed at any given time.
And that is why they call it fractional reserve banking.
There you go. Mystery solved.
Mystery solved. Now, here's another point that might surprise you. Scanlon explains that banks actually create money when they make loans.
They do. This is like the magic money tree.
Yeah. When a bank approves a loan for you, they're essentially increasing the amount of money circulating in the economy.
Because that money didn't exist before they gave you the loan.
Right. And they're not just lending it out, randomly.
Right, they're pretty careful.
Yeah. Scanlon points out that they consider where they think interest rates are going.
Right.
If they expect rates to rise, they might prefer to make more short-term loans.
Yeah, because if rates go up, they're stuck with that lower rate on a long-term loan.
Exactly.
So they want to be able to adjust quickly.
Exactly. They got to manage their own risk. Now, she also mentions, the role of the central bank and physical cash in this whole system. But here's a really crucial takeaway. She really emphasizes that banks are the primary force influencing how much credit is available.
They really are.
The overall money supply, interest rates, and even those payment systems that we use every day.
Think about it. You go to the ATM or you swipe your debit card. All that stuff is running through the banking system.
And she points out that this is all directly tied to the power of the U.S. dollar.
Which is a whole other fascinating topic.
Which leads us to the dollar's reign. So she doesn't just call it paper and coins. She calls it a powerhouse of economic strength.
It's a good phrase.
It really is. And it's true. I mean, it's the go-to currency for almost all international transactions worldwide.
Look, if you're doing business across borders, you're probably using dollars.
Probably using dollars.
And it's interesting because there's this whole discussion going on right now about the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency.
Right.
Because we've seen the rise of countries like China and, there have been some political issues in the U.S. And so some people are questioning whether the dollar will continue to hold that top spot.
Right.
Scanlon actually mentions this term, dollar doomerism, people who think the dollar's days are numbered.
Yeah, are we all doomed because of the dollar?
Right. But I think her point is that you have to look at the incentives behind who's saying that stuff. Sometimes it's people trying to, get attention for their newsletter or their investment strategy.
Or they're trying to sell you something.
Exactly.
And it's not just about the economics.
No.
Scanlon points out that there's a huge geopolitical influence that comes with the dollar.
Oh, yeah.
If a country decides to start using something else instead of the dollar, there can be real consequences.
Yeah.
The U.S. government has ways to put pressure on those countries,
Right. They can change trade agreements. They can adjust tariffs. Even military assistance can be affected.
Yeah, so it's a really powerful tool for the U.S. government.
It is. And here's another point that Scanlon makes that's kind of interesting. The dollar is often seen as the safest place to put your money during times of uncertainty.
Yeah, like even when there's a lot of talk about inflation maybe weakening the dollar, if things start to get really rocky globally, people still tend to want dollars.
That's like a safe haven.
Yeah, a safe haven. So what does all this mean for us?
Right. Getting back to the listener.
Yes. Scanlon's point is that the dollar's power, just like the value we assign to anything in the economy, really comes down to this collective belief.
It works because we all believe it works.
It's a social agreement.
Yeah.
Mind blown.
It really is when you think about it. Okay, so that leads us into part 3, how money is measured. We start with, the classic supply and demand.
It's Econ 101.
Yeah, it's like the foundational principle of economics.
Yeah.
And Scanlon defines it as this balancing act between how much of something is available that's supply and how much people want it that's demand.
And those two forces determine the price.
Exactly. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, on the surface.
But Scanlon then gets into, the complexities of modern supply chains.
Because it's not just like two people in a marketplace anymore.
No, we're talking about these global networks with ships and planes and trains and trucks moving stuff all over the world.
It's massive.
It's incredibly intricate, and it can be really fragile. I mean, we all saw that during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, all those grounded flights, the delays, those shipping costs just went through the roof.
Oh, yeah. I remember, trying to get anything shipped was a nightmare.
It was a total nightmare.
And everything was so much more expensive.
So Scanlon actually points to metrics like the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index and the Mannheim Used Vehicle Value Index. So economists are using these to track these pressures.
Right. They're trying to get a handle on just how much stress these supply chains are under.
And the pandemic, it really just highlighted how reliant we are on these very complex and ultimately fragile systems.
Because it's all interconnected.
So to give us a real-world example of this supply and demand in action, Scanlon talks about eggflation.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Remember when the price of eggs was insane?
It was crazy.
She explains that it was a bunch of things all happening at once. So on the supply side, we had that really cold and wet winter that affected the chicken feed rate. And then there were all those outbreaks of bird flu that reduced the number of egg-laying hens.
There were literally fewer chickens to lay the egg.
Fewer eggs, prices go up.
Classic supply and demand.
Right. But demand actually played a role too. We're eating more eggs per person now than we were a decade ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And Scanlon makes a really interesting point about the media's role in all this, because that widespread coverage of rising egg prices probably made it worse.
Oh, yeah, because people start to panic buy.
Exactly.
It's oh my God, eggs are going to be $20 a dozen. I better stock up.
Exactly. And that just strains that limited supply even more.
Right. So our expectations actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. But here's something that might reframe it all.
Okay.
Scanlon points out that when you adjust for inflation, the price of eggs in 2022, while it was high, it was actually lower than it was back in 2015.
Oh, wow. So it's all relative.
Yeah, it's all relative. So her takeaway is pretty simple. We needed more egg-laying chickens.
More chickens, more eggs, problem solved.
Problem solved. But it shows you just how interconnected all this is.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on, we've got another way we measure the economy, and that's GDP.
GDP. Gross domestic product. It gets thrown around all the time.
It does. It's one of those things that you hear on the news and you're like, yeah, should probably know what that means.
Yeah, what is that?
So Scanlon explains that GDP is basically the total dollar value of all the goods and services that a country produces over a specific time.
So it's like the whole enchilada.
It's everything.
Everything we make and do.
And she breaks it down into these main components. So there's what we buy, that's consumption. What businesses invest, that's investment. What the government spends, that's government purchases. And then the difference between what we export and what we import, that's net exports.
Okay.
So it's all of those pieces together that make up GDP.
And it's important to understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP.
Right. So nominal GDP is just the raw value of everything calculated using current prices. So it includes inflation.
Right. So if prices have gone up, nominal GDP is going to look higher, even if we're not actually producing more stuff.
Exactly. So real GDP is adjusted to remove the effects of inflation.
So it gives us a more accurate picture of whether we're actually growing or not.
Exactly.
And she uses this really fun example. She calls it the gingerbread Yeti economy.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Right. And she just shows like how you would calculate nominal and real GDP in this kind of simplified world. But she moves to this more critical point, which is that the kind of economic growth we have actually matters.
Right.
And she talks about debt-fueled growth, where basically the government is spending money or cutting taxes to try and boost GDP.
Right.
But that can lead to higher levels of national debt.
Which is always a bad thing, right?
Not always.
It depends. It depends.
And so she says it's generally considered healthier if that borrowing is being used for investments that are going to create more growth in the future.
Right.
If interest rates are low, and if that ratio of debt to GDP is stable or decreasing.
Yeah, so you want to make sure that the debt is manageable.
Right. You don't want it to get out of control.
Exactly.
And she also touches on productivity, which is another way to measure economic growth. And this is where she mentions the productivity paradox. Have you heard of this?
No, tell me about it.
Okay, so back in the 80s and 90s, there was all this investment in computers and technology, right?
Right.
But it didn't really show up in the overall productivity statistics right away.
Really?
Yeah, and so it's this question of like, well, how are we measuring this stuff? And, maybe it takes time for those technological advancements to really trickle down into the broader economy.
Right.
So it's not always a perfect measurement.
So what does GDP really tell us about how healthy a country is? Scanlon's point is that GDP alone is not a complete picture.
It's one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And she says, growth doesn't matter if there is nothing to support people.
I love that quote.
It's so true.
Because you can have a growing economy, but if people are struggling to make ends meet, then what's the point?
It's not really working for everyone. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to look beyond those just like pure economic numbers.
Totally. Okay, so let's move on to commodities.
Commodities.
So Scanlon defines this as like those basic raw materials that everybody uses.
So we're talking about agricultural products like wheat and corn, energy like oil and natural gas metals like copper and aluminum.
The building blocks.
Yeah, and she emphasizes how crucial they are for shaping inflation.
Right.
Impacting supply chains and really affecting the overall health of the economy.
And those markets are global, right?
Oh, yeah. They're traded all over the world.
Scanlon talks about how, globalization and all these external factors like weather patterns or geopolitical events have this huge impact on prices.
Right. So if there's a drought somewhere that's going to affect the price of wheat, if there's political instability in an oil-producing country that's going to affect the price of oil,
right,
it's all connected.
And she really highlights how interconnected these commodities are.
Like one thing affects another affects another.
Right. A change in the price of one commodity can like ripple through the entire system.
Exactly.
So she uses the example of higher natural gas prices leading to more expensive fertilizer.
Right.
Which then drives up the cost of growing crops.
Right.
Which then affects the cost of feeding livestock and then ultimately impacts the price of meat.
Right. It's this whole chain reaction.
It's crazy.
And it can be tough for countries to get the commodities they need, especially if they're competing with wealthier nations. Scanlon mentions the example of Pakistan trying to buy diesel fuel during the European energy crisis in 2022.
Right.
European countries were willing to pay more, so Pakistan basically couldn't get the supply.
It's like a bidding war.
Yeah. And she also talks about some of the things happening within specific commodity markets, like the rise of U.S. shale oil, but with this increased focus on giving returns to investors rather than just increasing the overall supply.
Wow.
Yeah. And she also talks about the growth of renewable energy, but it's kind of an interesting point that we still need, dirty energy to actually build all the infrastructure for those green technologies.
Right.
And then lastly, she mentions how artificial intelligence could play a big role in commodity management and extraction in the future.
That'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, so let's move on to something that we all feel very directly in our wallets. Inflation.
The big I word.
Yeah. Scanlon defines it pretty simply as like the rate at which prices are rising for goods and services.
But as we all know, it can be kind of tricky to measure.
It's not always straightforward.
Right, because it's not just about one thing going up in price. It's about this overall trend.
So Scanlon walks us through all the different ways that it gets measured. So there's the CPI, the Consumer Price Index.
Right, which is tracking the prices of a basket of goods and services that your typical household would buy.
Right. And then there's the PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index.
Right, and that's the one that the Federal Reserve actually prefers.
They do.
And it's based on actual spending data.
So it's a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah. And then she mentions the WPI and PPI, the wholesale price index, and the producer price index, which are looking at prices at, earlier stages of production.
You're right.
And then there's the GDP deflator, which is looking at overall changes in prices for everything produced in the economy.
So it's like, the macro view.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's interesting, she points out that the CPI and the PCE, even though they're both trying to measure the same thing, often come up with slightly different numbers.
Really?
Yeah. And that's because they're looking at slightly different baskets of goods and services.
Oh, okay.
They're using different weights for those items, and they calculate things a little bit differently. So it's not a perfect science.
No, it's not.
And she used the example of strawberry prices going up in 2022.
Strawberry.
To show how those inflationary pressures work. And she also talks about how things like, disruptions in the labor market can lead to inflation. Like if there aren't enough workers to meet the demand, then wages go up, and that can push prices up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole idea of inflation expectations, right? Like if people just expect prices to keep going up,
then they're going to act in ways that can make that happen.
Yeah, like they're going to demand higher wages, which leads to higher costs, which leads to even higher prices.
Well, it's this self-fulfilling cycle.
So what are the actual root causes of inflation?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right. So Scanlon touches on something called seller's inflation.
Okay.
So this is where companies with some pricing power raise prices to protect their profits.
Right. They're basically saying, hey, our costs are going up, so we're going to pass that along to consumers.
Exactly. And she distinguishes this from the idea of greedflation, which is this idea that companies are just being greedy and jacking up prices for no reason.
Which is a bit of a loaded term.
It is very loaded.
And it's not always that simple.
Right.
There are often real reasons why prices are going up.
And then she talks about the wage price spiral.
Right. So wages go up, prices go up, wages go up again. It's a spiral.
It just keeps going.
Yeah. And she also mentions this idea from former Fed Governor Lael Brainard called a price spiral, where final goods prices are increasing by more than the initial increase in input costs.
So it's like amplifying those price increases.
Yeah. It's not just a one-to-one thing.
So it's a really complicated issue.
It is. There's no easy answer.
No easy answer. Okay. To bring our deep dive to a close, we have to talk about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve.
The Fed.
The Fed. So Scanlon explains that the Fed's primary job is to maintain price stability and promote maximum employment.
Right. So they want to keep inflation under control and make sure as many people have jobs as possible.
And they have a whole set of tools that they use to try to achieve those sometimes competing goals.
Yeah, because sometimes those goals are actually pulling in opposite directions.
So she outlines those key tools, including reserve requirements, which is basically how much money banks have to keep on hand.
Right. They can't lend it all out.
Right. Then there's open market operations, which involves the Fed buying and selling U.S. government securities.
So they're basically trying to influence interest rates by controlling the supply of money in the system.
Right. Then there's these things called repo agreements, which are short-term loans for banks.
Right. It's a way for them to get quick cash if they need it.
Exactly. The discount rate is the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow directly from the Fed.
Right. It's like the emergency window.
Yeah. And then the Fed funds rate is the target rate that they want banks to charge each other for overnight lending.
So they're trying to control the overall cost of borrowing in the economy.
Exactly. And Scanlon makes this really important point that, being a central bank is not just about these technical mechanics.
No, it's a lot about psychology.
Yeah, it's managing expectations.
Right. Because if people believe the Fed is going to do something, they'll act accordingly.
So the Fed is trying to influence the economy not just through its direct actions, but also through what it says.
Right. They're trying to shape the narrative.
Exactly. Now, she briefly touches on the Fed's response to the 2020 economic crisis.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Huge. They lowered the Fed funds rate to almost zero, and they implemented quantitative easing.
QE.
QE.
Which is where they create new money electronically to buy these long-term bonds and other securities.
Right.
They're trying to push down long-term interest rates and just pump liquidity into the system.
Exactly. And she also touches on some of the more recent challenges, like those losses the Fed has experienced on its balance sheet as interest rates have gone up.
Right, because they bought all those bonds when interest rates were low, and now rates are higher, and those bonds are worth less.
Right.
And then there was the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, which some people blame on the rapid increase in interest rates.
It's been a roller coaster.
It has.
Okay, finally. Scanlon provides this great overview of the Federal Reserve System itself. So we've got the Board of Governors, the FOMC, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, the role of the chair.
It's a whole structure.
It's a lot.
Yeah, but it's important to understand how it all works.
It is. And she even mentions the historical context of its creation, which was really spurred by those financial panics of the early 1900s.
Right. Those bank runs were a big deal.
Yeah, and J.P. Morgan actually played a big role in resolving the bank runs of 1907.
Interesting. So that's how the Fed came about.
It is, and she talks about the FOMC's summary of economic projections, which includes their forecasts for inflation, GDP growth, unemployment, and the path of the Fed funds rate. It's a constant balancing act for the Fed.
It is. They're trying to steer this massive ship.
And hit that 2% inflation target.
Which is proving to be quite difficult.
It is, and Scanlon points out that there's a lot of uncertainty about how all this works, like even how much inflation expectations really influence actual inflation.
Right, because it's all based on human behavior.
Exactly. So let's take a moment to just recap the key concepts we've explored here from Kyla Scanlon's In This Economy.
Right, let's summarize.
So we started with like the evolution of money, from bartering all the way to those modern fiat currencies that we have today.
Right, from cows to digital dollars.
Exactly. And then we got into fractional reserve banking and how banks actually have a hand in creating money.
Yeah, that's a mind-blowing concept.
It is. And we talked about the global significance of the U.S. dollar and those debates about its status as like the world's reserve currency.
Will it stay on top? Who knows?
Who knows? And then we went back to those basic principles of supply and demand and how they determine the price of everything.
Right, the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly. And we unpacked how GDP is measured and some of the important nuances of economic growth.
Right, because not all growth is created equal.
Exactly. And we considered the crucial role that commodities play in our economy and in driving inflation.
Those raw materials that we all depend on.
And finally, we touched on monetary policy and that powerful influence of the Federal Reserve.
The Fed, the puppet master.
So by understanding these like foundational elements, you have this much clearer lens to interpret the economic news.
Right, you can cut through the noise.
Exactly.
And hopefully feel a little less overwhelmed by all of it.
Less overwhelmed, that's the goal. And Scanlon emphasizes this throughout her book, like this knowledge gives you the power to be more informed.
Right, to understand the connections between these seemingly unrelated events.
Exactly. So as you consider this whole intricate web of factors that influence our economy, everything from like the nature of money itself to those complexities of global supply chains to the actions of central banks, what element do you think has the most significant impact on your personal financial well-being? Expert.